This is the first Wednesday of this channel where I'm not reviewing episodes of Andor, and I am still thinking about this amazing season 1 week later after it ended. This chapter of canon was Star Wars at its best, and most unique. While it was a divisive series, it had its share of devoted fans both within and outside of the core Star Wars fandom. This also most likely marks the close of about 10 years of Tony Gilroy's time telling stories in the Star Wars universe, from his work on Rogue One and being the creator and showrunner of Andor. Now, I've seen chatter online from fans about how Tony Gilroy should be given a blank slate to continue creating Star Wars stories for essentially the rest of his career. I've also seen comments on how he should take over from Kathleen Kennedy as she gets closer to stepping down from her role leading Lucasfilm. But I think if people knew more about Tony Gilroy and his body of work, as well as his relationship with the Star Wars universe, it's easy to see that it is not what he is interested in and why it probably would not be a good idea. Now, Tony Gilroy is primarily a screenwriter. He has written films from the 90s like The Cutting Edge and The Devil's Advocate. He eventually turned to directing, with his debut being the thriller Michael Clayton, starring George Clooney. He was nominated for Best Original Screenplay and Best Director at the Oscars, and the film itself was nominated for Best Picture. Before having anything to do with Star Wars, he was probably most known for writing The Bourne Identity and the following 3 films of that franchise, eventually directing the 4th one. He also became known in Hollywood for being what is called a script doctor. His screenwriting credits for movies like Armageddon were for rewrites and revisions that he made to help bolster existing scripts. It is also likely he's played uncredited roles in helping with script rewrites and fixes. And his expertise in fixing scripts was what led to his hiring by Lucasfilm to contribute to Gary Whitta and Chris Weitz' work in writing Rogue One. He initially spent a few weeks on it, and then returned after principal production to write new scenes and direct some of those scenes in reshoots. At the time, Tony Gilroy did not consider himself a Star Wars fan. He has shared his experience about seeing the original film for the first time in theaters in 1977, but other than that, it's not clear how familiar he was with Star Wars in general after that point. He had to do the work to learn the canon and dive deep into the lore of the years of the rebellion leading up to Rogue One, leaning heavily on members of the Lucasfilm story group like Pablo Hidalgo. But he has also stated that his lack of fandom was what allowed him to get the Rogue One story out of the rut it was in. When Andor started being developed, he was invited by Kathleen Kennedy to be involved, and long story short, convinced Lucasfilm to go with his radical concept for the series as Disney was building up content for the launch of Disney+. He became the showrunner of Andor, a role in television that acts as the leading producer and writer of a series. What drew Gilroy to Andor was not continuing to work in the Star Wars universe, but the opportunity that it gave him to fully realize a story about revolution. He has mentioned multiple times that he is an avid student of history and took elements from the Russian Revolution, the French Revolution, and many others to tell the story of the formings of the Rebel Alliance. It's something he always wanted to do, but the freedom he found with Lucasfilm allowed him to take the risks and really spend all the money that he wanted to tell the story on a huge scale. Because it was a Star Wars story rather than a historical drama, he had that ability to have a revolution drama get greenlit by a major studio. However, as the show went on, he's become more reverent of the world and even goes on to say that he has evolved to become a contributor of Star Wars canon. So, should Tony Gilroy replace Kathleen Kennedy as the head of Lucasfilm? Definitely not. The president of a movie studio is less of a creative job and more of a business-driven position that happens to lead creative people and foster projects for them. That's nothing that Tony Gilroy is interested in, or maybe even qualified to do. Now, should he continue working in the Star Wars universe? Well, maybe, but I know he really wants to do other things. For him to spend 10 years of his career on something that he wasn't obsessed with at the beginning is already an amazing thing for a creative of his caliber. He is currently attempting to develop a movie about film scoring with Oscar Isaac, and I'm sure he has other ideas that he wants to try out. Plus, even if you think Andor is the best Star Wars story ever, it is still only one type of story to tell in this universe. He is unlikely to touch other time periods of Star Wars, or touch things like the Jedi, mythology-based stories, or even standard adventure stories that are still very vital to Star Wars. In the end, Gilroy says never say never, but I think the most we would see from him in Lucasfilm in the future is some consulting or script doctoring work. Also, his other stories are fantastic, and if you're not familiar with them, I'd recommend to branch out and check out Michael Clayton or start with The Bourne Identity.